Margaret Sullivan was 67 years old, a retired librarian from a small town in Pennsylvania called Willow Creek. Her life had unfolded like the pages of a well-worn novel, predictable, comforting, and filled with quiet joys. She and her husband, George, had married young, right after high school, and built a modest existence together. George worked as an accountant for a local manufacturing firm, crunching numbers day in and day out, while Margaret spent her days surrounded by books at the public library, helping children discover the magic of stories and adults find solace in history or fiction. They weren't wealthy by any stretch, or so Margaret had always believed. Their home was a cozy bungalow on Elm Street, with a wraparound porch where they'd sip iced tea on summer evenings and watch the fireflies dance. They drove an old Chevrolet sedan that George maintained meticulously, and their vacations were simple drives to nearby state parks or visits to relatives in Ohio. George had died 9 months earlier from a sudden stroke. It happened one ordinary Tuesday morning as he was tying his shoes, preparing for another day at the office. Even in retirement, he'd taken on part-time consulting gigs to keep busy. Margaret found him slumped in the hallway, his face peaceful, as if he'd just decided to take a nap. The loss shattered her. For months, she wandered the house like a ghost, touching his reading glasses on the nightstand, folding his sweaters that still carried the faint scent of his cologne. Their only child, Sophie, now 39, had stepped up during those dark days. Sophie lived in the same town with her husband, David, a salesman for a pharmaceutical company who always seemed to be on the road or chasing the next commission. Sophie visited often, bringing groceries, helping with paperwork, and even driving Margaret to her doctor's appointments. "Mom, you can't do this alone," Sophie would say, her eyes soft with what Margaret interpreted as genuine care. "Let me handle things." One chilly October afternoon, Margaret sat in the waiting room of Dr. Harlan's office, flipping through an outdated magazine about gardening. Her arthritis had been acting up, and Sophie had insisted on this checkup. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Her phone vibrated in her purse, an ancient model without all the fancy apps Sophie always teased her about. It was Sophie. "Mom," she said, her voice clipped and distant, like she was reading from a script. "David and I are heading to California tomorrow. Big opportunity, he got a job offer with a tech firm out there. I sold the bungalow and the Chevy. We needed the funds to make the move work. I'll wire you your share soon. Take care." Click. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her heart pounding in her ears. Sold the house? Her home of 45 years, where Sophie had taken her first steps, where George had carved their initials into the backyard oak tree. The Chevy, George's pride and joy, the car they'd bought used in 1985 and babied ever since. Memories flooded her, family barbecues on the porch, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper strewn everywhere, quiet nights reading by the fireplace. Sophie knew how much those things meant. Or did she? Margaret had signed some documents a month ago. Sophie said they were for power of attorney, just in case, to protect you. Margaret trusted her daughter implicitly. Now, that trust felt like a crumbling foundation. She didn't panic. Instead, a strange serenity washed over her. As the nurse called her name, Margaret remembered something she'd buried in her grief. A week before George's stroke, he'd given her a locked metal box from his study desk. "Maggie, keep this in the attic," he'd said with a wink. "If anything happens to me, open it when you're ready. It's our little insurance policy." In the chaos of the funeral and aftermath, she'd forgotten it existed. Now, it beckoned like a lifeline. Dr. Harlan pronounced her fit for her age, blood pressure a tad high, but nothing rest and a better diet couldn't fix. Margaret nodded absently, her mind on the box. She took the bus home, watching the autumn leaves swirl outside the window. Willow Creek passed by, the diner where she and George had their first date, the library where she'd worked for 35 years, the park where Sophie had learned to ride a bike. Home felt different now, tainted by betrayal. But as she climbed the porch steps, a small smile tugged at her lips. George had always been the planner, the one who balanced the checkbook and squirreled away pennies. What secrets had he hidden? Up in the attic, amid dusty boxes of old photo albums and holiday decorations, she found the metal box. It was heavier than she remembered. Her fingers fumbled with the key George had taped to the bottom. Inside, a stack of papers, envelopes, and a handwritten note on George's stationery. She sat on an old trunk, the attic's dim light filtering through a small window, and read. Dear Maggie, it began in his precise script. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that. I never wanted to burden you with finances, you hated numbers, remember? But over the years, I didn't just account for others, I invested for us. Those boring side gigs? They paid off. We own more than the bungalow. There's a rental duplex on Pine Avenue, 3 townhouses in the next county, and a strip mall unit downtown. Plus, stocks in blue-chip companies and a few mutual funds. It's all in a trust under your name only. Valued at over $1.8 million last I checked. I kept it quiet because I didn't want Sophie to expect handouts. I wanted her to earn her way, like we did. Love you forever, George. P.S. The lawyer is Tom Riley, call him. Margaret's eyes widened as she leafed through the documents. Deeds, account statements, brokerage reports, it was all there. George had started small, investing tax refunds and bonuses in the stock market back in the 80s. He'd bought distressed properties during recessions, fixed them up on weekends, and rented them out through a management company. The duplex? That's where Sophie and David lived, paying rent to what they thought was an anonymous landlord. The numbers blurred through her tears, bank balances in 6 figures, property appraisals that made her gasp. George, the unassuming accountant, had built an empire in silence. Why the secrecy? His note explained it, fear that money would change dynamics, that Sophie might resent or rely on them unfairly. Irony stung. Sophie had sold what she thought was all they had, leaving Margaret penniless, when in reality, she was wealthy beyond imagination. That night, Margaret paced the living room, touching the faded curtains and the armchair where George read his newspapers. Photos on the mantel showed a younger Sophie, gap-toothed grin at age 6, prom night at 17, wedding day with David. When had she changed? Was it David's influence, always talking about getting ahead and opportunities? Or had greed been lurking all along? The phone rang early the next morning. Margaret Sullivan reclaiming her life and asserting her newfound strength after discovering her late husband George's secret wealth. Here's a concise summary of the ending, tailored to your request for the conclusion. Sophie and David returned to Willow Creek, humbled by their failed venture in California. Overwhelmed by debts and the collapse of David's job, they ask to stay with Margaret. She invites them to her kitchen, where she reveals the truth about George's investments, the bungalow, Chevy, and multiple properties, including the duplex they rented, all belong to her through a trust. Sophie is shocked, tearfully apologizing for her greed and betrayal. Margaret, firm but forgiving, offers them a chance to rent one of her townhouses at a fair rate, with a condition to repay the undervalued proceeds from the fraudulent sales of the bungalow and Chevy over time. The story closes with Margaret, at 67, embracing her independence, traveling to state parks, driving a new car while preserving George's Chevy, and living richly in both wealth and self-respect, having set clear boundaries with her daughter while maintaining a path for reconciliation. Like and subscribe my channel.